I think Tim put me last because this last session is supposed to bring the conversation back to the level of abstraction we started with, and I think Tim knows that I'm not capable of diving below about 5 meters in these waters, and these guys I don't think have come up above 100 meters in the last hour. There were like combinatorics formulas in the last 3 talks. Wow. 7 hours, and I'm impressed you guys were able to keep up. So this talk, I decided I'm going to make it about foundational design principles, because one thing I've learned in like over a decade of consulting in different technical industries, most of which are such that I can't go very deep, I've noticed that strong technical people who come up to like high levels of technical leadership, invariably they have like really strong foundational design principles guiding their entire work. And what tends to happen is, if that foundational design principle is a good one, all these masses of like intricate detail that you have to like deal with, they tend to go mostly right, and luck kind of favors you in dealing with them. Whereas if your foundational design principle is off, everything starts going against you. So you start to get all these millions of details wrong. So since I can't talk about the details anyway, I want to talk about foundational design principles. So before I get started, I'd like all of you to kind of like think about what foundational opinionated design principle do you bring to your work in building crypto technology? Because that's what we're going to talk about. Okay, so this is a famous quote that's about a century old. You can do some digging to see who started that. People attribute it to George Orwell, but that's apparently apocryphal. Journalism is printing something someone does not want printed. Everything else is public relationships. I was trying to find a way to port it to crypto, and this is what I came up with. Censorship resistance is completing a transaction someone does not want completed. Everything else is yield farming. I am not technical enough to know whether this is an accurate idea or even like in the ballpark, but it sounds kind of right to me based on what I've heard today. So I'm kind of like 50% confident in it. Okay. So this is going to be a very easy talk as far as technical comprehension goes, but it might be a challenging talk as far as like, introspecting on your moral beliefs goes. So this is a picture I took on a walking tour yesterday of Istanbul, and the guide pointed out this stone. It's on the side of Topkapi Palace. Most people miss it. It's near a fountain, and tired tourists might sit on it. And he told us that this is actually the chopping block used by the executioners of the Ottoman Empire. And he told me something very interesting, that for executioners, the Ottoman Empire always picked deaf and mute. So they could not hear what the condemned person might be pleading, might be like saying in their defense, asking for like mercy. They could not hear and they could not speak. So it's kind of like not quite censorship resistance, but flip it around. This is like dissent resistance from the Sultan's point of view. So and there's a fountain nearby for the executioner to wash the sword. And the other thing he told us was that anything the condemned man had, it was usually a man, anything the condemned man had on him when he was being executed, like jewelry, personal possessions, it all went to the executioner as a tip. And since we've been talking a lot about tips and blocks today, here's a block. You get tips for like doing things on that block. All right, so this is one anecdote I wanted to bring up. Here's another one. Another part of the tour was the Hagia Sophia. It's everything it's reputed to be, so if you've been spending all week here and have any time left and you haven't been, please do go. But actually, I found a few interesting sites of censorship here. As you all know, Islam has a prohibition against representation of like human forms in the religion, and it's not like fully enforced in a very conservative way. But since the Hagia Sophia was originally a church, there are obviously iconographic elements throughout the church. And the one on the left over there, that's on top of what used to be the main altar and now is the sort of prayer niche of the Islamic prayer ritual. And there's pictures of like Jesus and Mary right above it. And since that faces Mecca, you can't have representation there, so that part is covered up. No, sorry, that's the middle one. So the middle one is just above the altar, so that's Jesus and Mary covered up. The one on the left, this is in the entrance to the main chamber, and this is, I think, Justinian offering Constantinople to Jesus or something like that, so that image is visible. But there is a little curtain there that's attached to a rope, so you can pull it up and cover that up if necessary, if there are people praying right outside. So there's an option to censor over there. And on the far right, this is to the left of the altar, so it's not facing Mecca, but if you're facing slightly left and up, there's an image. I think that must be Gabriel or somebody, but that's not censored. So, and Hagia Sophia, it struck me as interesting that it translates to holy wisdom. This seems like a pretty wise approach to handling like censorship in a very pragmatic and charged context. Okay, sorry, what am I doing? Okay, so foundational design opinions. So I'm about as much of an outsider as would ever speak at an event like this. And my sense of the foundational design opinion that drives not just censorship resistance parts of the technology, but all of crypto is the exit versus voice dichotomy with a strong exit bias. So most of you have probably not actually read the book. Perhaps you heard Balaji's talk about 10 years ago where he made this a meme in Silicon Valley. But yeah, this is a book about how when you don't like what's happening in an organization or a society, you have two choices. You either exit or you voice your opinion, right? And they're not a symmetric pair of choices because voice is by nature more informative. You complain, you say things. So voice is a more informative opinion. And exit, taken alone, it just provides like warning sign that people are leaving. It's kind of like a negative signal. And loyalty, which many people miss, it's part of the book's title. Loyalty affects or modulates this decision. So you might choose exit versus voice depending on the loyalties you feel, right? And some of the points the author Hirschman makes about exit versus voices, exit is fundamentally biased towards economic solutions versus voice being a bias towards political solutions, right? So there is a strong economics bias. But think about this. Crypto has a strong uncritical exit bias. Like I said, it goes way back, things like forks, things like run your own node, decentralization. But censorship resistance, if you asked anybody outside of this kind of context what they think it means, it's going to be a strongly voice-oriented problem. You use the word censorship in normal conversation, you're going to hear about newspapers being censored, journalists being jailed, so it's a strongly voice-oriented problem. It's not about people leaving, it's about people staying in and fighting, right? So it's not that you're being censored in one medium, so you go off to another medium. It's not that, you're deplatformed of one social medium and you go pick another one. It's not that kind of choice. Voice is typically a choice that has to do with, censorship resistance is typically a voice problem. So the question then becomes, the default opinionated design tendency of crypto, which is exit-oriented, is there a fundamental tension there? And I think there is. Okay. So exit, if you think about like a reductio ad absurdum analysis of what that leads to, if every time you enter into a conflict with somebody and you choose between exit and voice and you constantly keep choosing exit, and you keep going to smaller and smaller contexts, what's going to happen? You're going to like keep fragmenting. You're going to like be unconstrained. This is an approach that frames censorship resistance as being unconstrained. So you're going to go more and more sort of like forking away, and you will remain more and more unconstrained, but with fewer and fewer relationships until you're perfectly unconstrained with zero relationships. This I think of as the libertarian endgame of you are alone on your island, nobody can censor you, but nobody's listening to you anyway. So there's a fundamental problem with this line of thinking, right? And this is typically what libertarians celebrate as sovereignty. And the philosopher to read about what sovereignty means is Hannah Arendt, and she made like a really powerful point that's really stuck with me. This is from her book, The Human Condition. She points out that sovereignty is not freedom. You alone on your desert island is not freedom. That's sovereignty. The difference is that you need other people around you to experience true freedom. So freedom, by definition, is something that only exists in a plurality of other people. It does not mean you're assimilated into a Borg where you have no individual identity. In fact, she explicitly rejects that. It means you are like in the public square, you're constantly talking, and so forth. So that's freedom. And an exit-oriented bias will lead you further and further away from that fullest sense of freedom. And from the point of view of Hannah Arendt, sovereignty is a kind of degenerate human condition. You're less than human, you're subhuman. And this is like a strong statement, I know, but I honestly believe this about most card-carrying libertarians. Okay, another huge wall of text. This one, I asked GPT to pull out some quotes for me from the novel by Sartre, No Exit. And you've probably heard the phrase, hell is other people. And most people don't quite know the context of where it comes from, and they assume it's something like, you're annoyed by your neighbors, and if you're stuck with your neighbors forever, it's going to be annoying, and that's going to be like hell. That's kind of like the superficial interpretation. The actual interpretation in the novel is, when you are in relationships with other people, inevitably they see parts of you that you don't see yourself. They hold up a mirror, they reflect your Jungian shadow, things like that. And what you feel is trapped or tormented by the mere existence and gaze of others. Simply other people looking at you, holding up a mirror to who you are, reflecting parts of your identity that you might find uncomfortable or distressing. That's what hell is other people means. So being in relationships with people, in a nexus of relationships with people, and being free rather than sovereign is hellish. So that's kind of an interesting paradox, isn't it? Like, we are defining freedom in a way, following Hannah Arendt, that, if you also go with Sartre, is hellish. So we are defining freedom as a kind of hell that you choose to live in, right? So think about this, like what this says about the default exit bias of crypto. Okay, so I kind of see this much more in the Bitcoin community, of course, than in the Ethereum community. In the Ethereum community, you kind of see libertarian leanings, but you do see people slowly pulling back, like occasionally towards questioning fundamental libertarian principles, asking if sovereignty is really the be-all and end-all. There are the right philosophical curiosities driving the question of what should our fundamental design decisions and design opinions be. But exit and voice, I think, because it requires like a level of, introspective self-awareness to understand properly. And most people, their idea of like picking exit over voice is, you read Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged at age 16, that's the limit of the philosophical questioning you've ever done. And then you go around basically parroting like sophomoric libertarian, talking points for the rest of your life. And you never really go beyond that. But if you take the exit and voice dimension truly seriously, it's actually really hard. Being in a nexus of other people and being truly free and being in hell is other people, that's what it takes to navigate the exit-voice dichotomy properly, and barely anybody does that. Most people are like, I want to live on my desert island with my guns. It's like that cartoon picture. So, and I think it's kind of like unnecessary to tie the design of complex technologies like Ethereum to, self-growth and self-awareness. You don't have to do that. Is there a way to approach the fundamental design question of something like Ethereum without having to be, an enlightened philosopher and processing these questions? So I think there is. So I want to offer you another alternative spectrum that has been really useful for me over the last few years. This is Professor Emeritus of safety and accident investigation research. He studied nuclear reactors, air crashes, things like that for decades, Eric Hull-Nagel. And he came up with this principle he calls the ETO principle, efficiency, thoroughness, trade-off, which basically says that you have to choose between being efficient and being thorough. And this can be hard to get if you don't have a bunch of varied examples in your mind, but think about nuclear reactor safety. That's not something you want to efficiently do profit maximizing and solve for very narrow, legible cost functions and do very efficiently and maximize your profits. You want to be very carefully checking every possible failure mode, thinking through all the contingencies that could happen. Nuclear reactor safety is a thoroughness-biased domain. Airline safety, airplanes, you don't want them crashing all over the place. Again, thoroughness-driven field, right? Whereas other things, they can be efficiency-driven. If you're creating Google Maps or any kind of mapping algorithm for getting from point A to point B, you probably want the shortest distance or shortest time or something like that. That's solving an efficiency-oriented optimality problem. You don't want to wander all over the map, right? So think of thoroughness as wandering all over the map, checking everything, making sure everything is sort of covered. So the Eto fallacy. This is a principle that Hollnagel came up with after doing a whole bunch of accident investigations, I guess. It's this idea that when something bad happens, whether it's an air crash or a nuclear reactor meltdown or FTX melting down or the tornado cache thing you guys are all talking about all day, there is a tendency to look back once the data is in and say that you should have done this, 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 this. And there's something fundamentally acausal and impossible about that. You can't do that. You can't fix an efficiency bias in ex ante efficiency bias with an ex post thoroughness bias in investigation. You can't say you should have been that thorough in covering that stuff, right? You have to have a thoroughness bias straight up. You have to have it on day one, not after the accident happens. So that's the Eto fallacy, which he uses as a critique of most accident investigations being bullshit. So exit versus voice had its own implications. So exit is economics biased and voice is politics biased. Similarly, this principle has its own biases. I think efficiency has a strong corporate and private utility bias, so things like shareholder value or efficiency metrics. And it creates atomized customers, people who are naturally primed to become libertarian pilled and become completely isolated and atomized, whereas thoroughness has a commons and public utility bias, so citizen values, and it tends to create peoples, so peoples as in in a town square, for example, all interacting, who are bound in webs of mutualism. So efficiency versus thoroughness also has implications just as exit over voice, but I think they're less ideologically loaded. Yes, there's to some extent, it's a similar spectrum here, but I think it's a little bit more orthogonal. And it's important, I want to reemphasize that webs of people is not being part of a Borg. It means finding your freedom in relationships with others, where I think Ursula Le Guin had a really good quote about this, which is, to be whole is to be part. So until you're part of something, you can't be fully whole, fully human. So think of that as thoroughness. This is my last slide, and I did have improv stuff that I had in mind, but I'm actually not going to go there. I'm just going to stop here and let the discussion take over. But yeah, I am a consultant. I have to include a 2x2 in every presentation I do. I think currently the crypto world is strongly exit biased and strongly efficiency biased, because it does have equivalence of shareholder value maximization and so forth. And I think it needs to get to a slight voice bias, at least in the Ethereum corner. Let Bitcoin explore the space of strong exit bias. Somebody needs to do it. But Ethereum, I think, can be more voice biased, and it can be much more heavily thoroughness biased, which means it's going to start looking like a public commons way more than private. And I want to make a point about, so there's a meta thing going on here. I earlier used the example of exploring a map and the shortest path as, by the way, by training, I'm a aerospace controls guy, and I did a lot of research in path planning and robotics back in the day. So these are natural metaphors for me. But yeah, you don't want to go from where we are to where we need to be in an efficient straight line. That would be both ironic and defeat the purpose. If you try to go efficiently towards thoroughness, you can kind of see the problems that might occur. So I think the trajectory in green is kind of what you need to do, explore the design space a little bit more inefficiently, lazily, wander around, see what the implications of exit versus voice and thoroughness versus efficiency are. And maybe that's the right place to land, maybe it's not. Yeah, I think I'll stop here, and yeah.